We are back with another coaching video. This time we're going to be taking a look at Prot Paladin gameplay, and this comes from my very awesome, lovely Patreon supporter, Jackie Mays. First and foremost, I love analyzing dungeon runs and trying to kind of figure out what goes right and wrong in a run and how to really optimize it. So this is something that I really enjoy doing. I guess a quick plug here, if you're interested in me reviewing your gameplay, I've had a lot of in general inquiry since I started doing these videos more often on YouTube. If you're interested in me reviewing your gameplay, you can always reach out to me on Discord and I can give you the information, but it's typically for Patreon supporters. So you can check out the link down below for my Patreon page. But anyways, let's jump into it. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at a 20 Underrot run. Jackie Mays is playing a 441 Protection Paladin in this run. Now, this was a few weeks ago, so he has improved. And he's already gotten the feedback, but this video is coming a little bit later than I'd like to. I've just been super busy, but I want to kind of go over some pre-note runs as well as analyzing the talent tree as well as the gearing or the gear that he has. So this is my first time actually really dissecting Prot Paladin gameplay on my channel, but it's a tank that I'm quite intimately familiar with. Now, the big things that I keep an eye out for when I'm analyzing runs for this spec is one, of course, Shielded Righteous uptime. This is really important. It's your general form of mitigation. It increases your armor. It actually does a fair bit of your damage as well. And maintaining this means you won't instantly fall over. Accompanied with this, another big aspect of the Protection Paladin is their concentration uptime and or placement. Are you placing it down consistently? And if you need to move or kite, given whatever the circumstances may be, are you replacing it? Paladins in their current state are typically stacking mostly haste and mastery. And for those who don't know, mastery actually increases the value of the damage reduction aspect of your concentration while you're standing in it. So that's why it's really important. So if you're stacking mastery, you really want to be inside of that concentration. I'm also going to be looking at holy power generating and spending. Are you overcapping? Are you making sure you're trying to optimize almost every global when you can with things like judgment? Are you filling with Blessed Hammer when you're out of range or before you go into a pull? Those kind of things. Are you spending too much on Word of Glory, which is then obviously might negatively impact your solder uptime? And lastly, I'm just going to be looking at proper cooldown usage and recovery. Now there's minor things like making sure you're targeting casters with Avenger Shield. That's a pretty big aspect of the Protection Paladin. It's a really big thing they have in their kits. Are you properly using externals? Are you making sure that you're giving players freedom when they need it? Are you using Blinding Light or Hammer of Justice when it's needed? So there's an all-encompassing kind of thing when it comes to cooldowns, both offensive damage cooldowns, defensive cooldowns, as well as utility. So those are all the things I'm going to be keeping an eye out for in this video. Okay, really quick, let's dissect their class tree. All right, we are over on Raider.io, and I really want to break down. First, let's just talk about gear really quick. Now, in this run, most of your gear is pretty good. The only thing that's a little off is Undulating Spore Cloak, for example. But most of your gear is pretty okay. Now, bracers can be improved. Again, you really want that haste mastery. Having crit mastery isn't the worst thing in the world, especially crit has a little bit of value with the way that your 4-set works, where your critical strikes with judgment have a chance to reset Avenger's Shield. So it's not the worst thing in the world, but again, haste is so valuable that you pretty much want haste on every single item. So with that being said, Spore Cloak was a little bit of an odd choice. Typically, you don't need this as a tank unless you're playing Brewmaster. And even then, there's a lot of controversy on whether you should use it or not. In terms of pure single target damage, you can probably get away with running the Shadow Flame Armored patch. But again, Undulating Spore Cloak, I'm not going to, say it's the worst thing to use. It's a nice little extra defensive. Paladins just are a little bit too spiky to constantly benefit from the healing aspect of it, but the little cheat death whenever you drop below 30% health can be quite useful. Again, belt's fine. With that, I would say maybe your ring having high mastery, low verse isn't necessarily the best. You'd probably want a haste mastery ring. Ironically enough, Underrot drops a haste mastery ring, so if you would get it from obviously this run, spoilers, you don't, or in future Underrot runs, that's probably your best bet, or a crafted ring in future weeks. And then your Zakali Chaos Grapnel. There are better damage trinkets out there, but in terms of what I would recommend, I don't really have any crazy suggestions. A lot of the raid trinkets are really good if you can get your hands on it, but it's kind of up in the air. Obviously Beacon would be really cool to have, but it's a little bit more difficult to get your hands on. In terms of dungeon trinkets, trying to farm a Mark of Dargrul from Neltharion Slayer isn't the worst thing in the world. It does give crit, but it also does like a fairly good bit of damage if you're looking for something to increase your overall damage in a key. If you're looking for survivability, same thing. Neltharion Slayer has Shard of Rockmora plus Talisman of the Cragshaper. Both fairly valuable. Everything else looks pretty good. Okay, let's jump into your talents though really quick, because there are a couple things in your class tree that I would definitely change. So here was your build at the time of running this key. Quickly looking at the class tree, there's a few talents that I would a little iffy on. Unbound Freedom, it is a fine thing to have. It is movement speed increase for both yourself and your target that you cast it on. Lightforged Blessing, also not the strongest talent choice as well. More often than not, Lightforged Blessing is going to be a massive amount of overhealing. Also, there's other stronger talents that just make you tankier in general. And then last but not least, you have Fate's Armor, which again, the armor you're getting from Shield of the Righteous is already so high that you don't necessarily need the extra armor from Fate's Armor and their stronger choices in this tier of the tree. So I would drop 2 of the 3. You would drop Fate's Armor, and I would probably pick up Of Dusk and Dawn. And then I would also drop Lightforged Blessing. But now dropping this means you need to pick up something else in this area. It's pretty common for people to pick up Sacrifice of the Just and then go into the bottom half of their tree like this. I think this is what you had set up here. And you're missing one. Oh, and then your point was in Divine Purpose. Now, Divine Purpose is cool. It's really fun to get kind of the free resets or the free Word of Glory spenders, so Solder or Word of Glory. But I would advise dropping this for Seal of Order. Now, again, do you have to? Not necessarily, but this is what I would prefer if I was playing my Paladin in this run. But again, if you want to play Divine Purpose, it's fine too. But these are the changes I would make. You can keep Unbound Freedom. If you are going to swap off of Unbound Freedom, there's a few other things you can get. There are some players who run Punishment. You can also drop Unbound Freedom if you ever need to, pick up things like Fist of Justice or turn evil for Afflicted weeks, or not afflicted, Incorporeal weeks. You can pick up Red Aura if you want more damage instead of running Diva Aura, but again, that depends on the key level. So there's a few options, but Unbound Freedom would be typically the talent you might want to drop to pick up any of these other talents that might be needed on certain weeks. Moving into your spec tree, this tree isn't as doesn't have as many like issues. You are running Light of the Titans in this run specifically. I would drop this and just pick up Inmost Light. This makes your Eye of Tyr do 300% more damage and have a 25% reduced cooldown. So it's now going to be on a 45-second track, and it's going to actually give you a little bit better snap threat. So you don't feel like you have to like do your damage first and then use Inmost or Eye of Tyr. You can just go in with Eye of Tyr, or like arguably you go in and you can Eye of Tyr a little bit earlier. But for the most part, the tree is pretty good. Yeah, and that's really it. All right, let's jump into the run. All right, I'm going to go over the first couple pulls of the run. Most of the mistakes that Jackie Mays makes throughout the run are fairly consistent. This is common through most videos that I end up watching. Typically, these kind of mistakes are typically habit that need to be broken. So pointing them out is the best way to do that. And then obviously in future keys, practicing fixing those habits, turning good habits or bad habits into good habits. So that is the goal here. All right, so moving into the first run. So you guys are playing with the Fire Mage, and that is something to actually kind of keep in mind because it actually justified some of the pulls in here. Fire Mage is one of those classes similar to like Arcane Mage that wants a extremely beefy target that we typically call a sponge, and they can sink all of their damage into that target, and that damage will spread / be applied to everything nearby. We're going to see a kind of interesting pull at the start. Right out of the gate, you ended up pulling ticks. Anyone who pushes probably above like 20s, 22s, 24s, probably cringe a little bit here. Ticks are extremely devastating. The bleed that they apply is super, super nasty to the tank. Now, luckily you are playing Paladin, so you do have access to Bubble, and you are playing Dark Iron Dwarf, so you have access to Fireblood to remove those tick stacks, but most other tanks would instantly get vaporized. Not only that, but when they die, they do an AoE burst of damage, which can obviously hurt the tank, but more importantly, hurt your DPS. In higher keys than 20s, this will, on Fortified Week specifically, this will typically put DPS into the dirt without major defensives. I would recommend not pulling them. You can walk around the right-hand side, pull the Maggot Matron into the next pack, but that's like the big thing here. And now, right off the bat too, something that I noticed, and it could be great, but I have an issue with these kind of things, is you're running a rotation helper. They, like I said, they can be great. They can really help you nail and kind of implant the rotation into your head, and they do a pretty good job at doing that. But what I don't like about rotation helpers, at least when you're getting into higher keys, is that due to the dynamic environment, sometimes you just like need to deviate away from your rotation. Whether it's using spells like Blessing of Freedom, using things like Bubble or certain defensives, or trinkets. The program script can't register that regardless. Like throughout the most of the run, I was trying to really make sure that it wasn't deviating too much. And for the most part, the rotation aspect of it is fine. It tells you when to solder. It tells you like when you refresh a judgment charge or something like that, it'll update dynamically. But it was also like advising you to use things at the wrong time or to not use things when you should have used them. So things like Bubble, it was also like there was a lot of times throughout the key where it was like just telling you to use Festermouth's Splinter at like the most inconvenient times. I was just like, it's not necessarily where you'd actually want to use it. Anyways, enough ranting on that. The pull ended up going down fine because you guys have a lot of burst damage. And then your second pull was really aggressive. You actually pulled the patrol that's on the ramp plus the 3 hunters and another priest. So now you have 2 priests in the pull, 4 hunters and a matron. This can be dangerous too because of the headhunter's ability to snare party members, and because you probably should have used defensive on the ticks. You guys are now a little bit dry. Now, one thing I will point out here, you do a pretty good job at keeping one of the priests completely locked down with Avenger's Shield, and because you have paladins in your group, you have access to Blessing of Freedom, so if someone does get rooted into a matron's charge, you can always freedom them out of it. And the only thing I really want to point out here is I want to mention your positioning. I would try to create like a little bit more distance between where the mobs are positioned here and these ticks off to the, I guess, like right-hand side of the entrance of the dungeon, because I've seen way too many times where people body pull these ticks and it will lead to a wipe, especially in higher keys. Now, up to this point, you've been doing a pretty good job at using some of your cooldowns, and just your general rotation is fine. You're keeping up solder, you're sending in your consecration, but over the course of the key, it does get worse. There's a lot of times where you don't necessarily place down consecration early in the pull, or you kite out of it and then you forget to put it down, which can be fairly punishing. Once this pack goes down, you go into the next pull. What I would recommend here is ramping Holy Power. This is something that happened on the first pull as well. When you're waiting for the kind of like bubble to start, the key to start, basically you have 10 seconds, you can send out 3 or 4 Blessed Hammers in that time frame. And same with going into this pull. You can use Blessed Hammer a couple times before getting into the pull, generating Holy Power, meaning you can go right in with solder, which is good damage, which will help keep threat, and it requires you to have like less judgment and not to necessarily require any form of mitigation going right into a pull, which sometimes it does, where you might have to use Ardent, you might have to use Guardian Magic Kings, you might have to use Sentinel. Because you weren't wrapping Holy Power here, and the way that the mobs are kind of just generally positioned on pull, you actually ended up not gaining threat on one of the mobs, who ended up slapping your party member silly, and that's just not good. Make sure you're using Taunt as quick as you can when you notice that this is happening, and ramping Holy Power before the pull will be good. Now, I will mention this throughout the rest of the dungeon. There are pulls where you ramp Holy Power, but there are pulls where you kind of forget that's a thing. Paladin's in a kind of an interesting spot where you can kind of like always be hitting a button, even when you're running from pack to pack. You can keep hitting your Blessed Hammer. Okay, and then moving into first boss. You had a very questionable first, like, final stand, like, on pull. It's not bad to use frequently, but there is a time and a place to use it, especially since you just use Sentinel, so you're basically overlapping defensives. And another thing here is like making sure you're replacing your consecration whenever you move or it expires. This boss is a little jerky because the boss ports around, the ad spawns across the room, then the ad ports, like there's a lot of like micro movements here, but just make sure you're inside of that consecration, or at least that it's down. There's times where you just like forget to put it down. And then about 60% through the boss fight, it seems like you got a little flustered in your rotation. You kept trying to hit judgment during a GCD, and then it wasn't going off, so you would hit another button, and you basically didn't cast judgment for a few seconds. This isn't like a huge deal, but if you're really trying to optimize your single target damage, judgment takes priority pretty much over everything. Of course, Avenger's Shield, kicks, and it does a fair bit of damage in AoE, but in terms of single target, especially when Sentinel is up, you want to be just slamming judgment, and you really want to make sure you're not GCD locking yourself, that you fall behind on that rotation. Because sitting on 2 charges of judgment, very not good. And then at the very end, your healer ended up dying because of a missed kick. Most blood bolts will target the tank, unless it's the first cast of the ad when it first spawns. It'll typically default to a random player, but normally that's the healer because of the instantaneous threat that they have from just like general hots and healing. So you either want to make sure you bank a rebuke for when that ad spawns, or make sure you're saving an Avenger Shield cast when it spawns as well. Obviously, it's hard to hold on to that, but with boss timers, it's actually pretty accurate. So once Lex is like about to cast Blood Bolt, you can make sure you bank a reset on your Avenger Shield. And then at the very end of the fight, you just like panicked a bit, and then you ended up getting hit by Creeping Rut from that Blood Effigy. Just make sure you're obviously dodging that. All right, so I kind of want to blast through the rest of the run very quick. General mistakes throughout most of these pulls is either concentration falls off, like you step out of your concentration and you don't replace it. You had kind of awkward uses of defensives. So what's really cool about the Paladin is you have constant cooldown reduction on most of your major CDs. So Ardent Defender, your Sentinel, Bubble are all getting cooldown reduction, and in Guardian Mage and Kings, the only cooldown that you're not getting reduction on is Eye of Tyr, but Eye of Tyr is only 45 seconds if you're taking Inmost Light. It's a minute if you aren't. So you want to make sure you're kind of rotating through these consistently to minimize the damage you're going to take, period. All right, let's just kind of like dive in. So the fourth pull right after boss, you pull Ticks. Again, I don't recommend doing this. You even pull up details at the end of the pull when you died, and you were taking 180k damage per second. Now, you had Fireblood. I don't think you, obviously, like, it was in a weird spot on your action bar. You just didn't hit it. If you also didn't bubble on the first boss, you would have had bubble here too. In that case, probably could have saved the pull, but the fact that you pulled these, just not good. You can actually skip around them just by walking to like the right and kind of sneaking through. You don't need a rogue or anything. You just got to be careful. Just skip these. You don't need the percent at all. So yeah. And then for most of Kragmaw's room, you can be pretty aggressive. My rule of thumb is like always have like 5 targets. Rots are pretty much free. And then you want to keep it down to 1 Lasher, 1 Swarmer. And if there's like 1 or 2 Maggots, that's fine. I recommend 1, but if you have 2, it's like not hard. You either have to commit a stop, like a stun to them, or just make sure you're dodging the frontal. But Sonic, like the Sonic Boom or whatever it's called from the Swarmers, and the Decaying Mind from the Lashers are both dangerous. Now, luckily with Avenger Shield, you can kind of just sit on them, but it's not too bad. So this area kind of was a clusterfuck. Like someone body pulled a bunch of extra Lashers. It's not like the biggest deal in the world, but just make sure you're very consistent with your movement through here. You also sat on Sentinel for a good bit. You pretty much want to hit Sentinel on cooldown. There's no reason not to. Now, it clearly was due to like a little bit of panic here since there was body pulled Lashers. Just make sure you're using it all the time. And I do want to just like note on that, if there ever is a body pull like this and threat seems to be somewhat of an issue, remember that Final Stand is an AoE taunt. And sometimes you won't take enough damage in like a 20 to probably jeopardize your own health outside of ticks. So feel free to use that bubble. If you're like, oh shit, something just got pulled, kind of run into it and then just use bubble. It'll AoE taunt everything and then you'll be set. Again, and then through most of this room, it was just like you were using a good bit of your defensives, just like Ardent. You're just not using Ardent Defender. And with Ardent Defender cooldown reduction, it's like a 40-second cooldown. All right, Kragmaw. First things first, like just make sure you're outranging the Indigestion cast. You can do this by simply just like running backwards. It doesn't really require Divine Steed as long as you're moving, and since you're running Unbound Freedom, you can just Freedom yourself instead, and then save your Divine Steed for the intermission phase. This does a ton of damage and ends up getting you killed a little bit later. And then another thing was like, you weren't really helping stepping on ticks. If everyone in your party helps step on ticks, and then like outside of maybe the healer because they might be a little bit busy, Kragmaw is like a joke of a fight. What typically ends up wiping people on in this boss encounter is ticks. Later in the fight too, a tick spawned and was on your healer for like a good bit of time. I highly recommend taunt swap, like taunting it or getting some damage onto it. Now it's partly on your healer to like run into melee to make sure it's easier for you to pick up threat, but a simple tab target would suffice. And then you died with Eye of Tyr and Bubble available. Both of these would have probably kept you alive. At the very end of the fight, you also weren't standing your concentration. Just make sure you're paying attention to this. I also want to say this. You did it on the tick pull earlier, but at the end of the fight, you looked at why you died. This is such a good practice. Like, I love when I see people actually look at why they die. You want to learn from those mistakes. Analyzing like why you died. Oh, you died from a tick. Oh, you died from indigestion. Okay, how do I fix that? That's the next step, but knowing why you died is also really important. So keep doing that. Right after Kragmaw went down, you guys did this single worm and you went down to kind of pull the patrol. When you do this, depending on the patrol's position, you either want to open with like a taunt, which is fine, which is what you did. But based on the position of where the pack was, it was going to take you more than 3 seconds to get down and back up. So if that's going to be the case, you want to try to stall the horror a little bit longer. And luckily for the Paladin, you have Hammer of Justice to do that. It's a 6-second stun. That would have bought you enough time. And then when you got back, you could have then used Taunt to get threat. What ends up happening is you use taunt, you ran down the hill, grabbed the pack, tried to get back up, and in that amount of time, the worm ended up meleeing one of your DPS. Again, it's only a 20. It hits your paladin, which are pretty tanky, but you kind of need to like gauge that when you get there and use either of those. You guys took down the defilers just fine, so nothing really too crazy. Just make sure you're really optimizing your Avenger Shield procs. Now, when it comes to third boss, you want to be fairly careful on your positioning here. There's like a lot of movement, so it's really important to constantly be replacing your concentration whenever you do have to move. And then in the first set, you ended up stepping on mushrooms. It looks like on purpose, but you stepped on mushrooms while you still had an upheaval. You want to make sure you are only stepping on mushrooms when it's absolutely needed, and you want to clear with upheaval and the shockwave first. You get 2 in each rotation. The first set is typically shockwave, upheaval, and then most sets after are going to be upheaval, shockwave. It's just the way that the spell queuing works with the Festering Harvest. And then again, I'll say it again, you just weren't using Ardent when you should. Just pretty much, general rule of thumb, Ardent Defender can be used on cooldown. And then about 60% into the fight, Consecration and Shield of the Righteous both fell off. Make sure you're keeping these up. Right after the Spore Caller died, you pulled one worm and then chained in the Death Speaker. You can definitely grab, or not the Death Speaker. You can easily grab that Defiler quicker because you're a Paladin. You can pretty much lock things down using both Avenger Shield, Hammer of Justice, Rebuke, Blinding Light. These all stop the worm, and then your just kicks can stop the Defiler. Oh, and be sure not to stand in the totem. This pull specifically can be really explosive for the tank in terms of damage. So you had a really good use of bubble early on. It gets you instant threat because of AoE taunt. It obviously makes you immune to taking damage. But the only thing that I would kind of critique here is that you ended up using Eye of Tyr as a damage reduction while you still had 3 seconds of bubble active. So make sure you're not having that overlap in defensive unless it's needed. But the thing is, you don't need another defensive if you're immune to damage. Now, there are other tanks that don't have immunities, all of them. So it's like you could sometimes use Shield Wall and Last Stand on a Warrior at the same time. That's fine. You can sometimes use Dampen Harm and Fortifying Brew or Diffuse Magic on a Brewmaster, but using a defensive on top of an immunity just doesn't really make too much sense. I'd understand it if you were doing it for a little bit of damage from Inmost Light, but again, you're not running it in this key. And then shortly after this, you just forgot to refresh Consecration. It's very, very important that you keep this down. And then I'm going to skip over a few of these pulls. The last pull right before you get to the last boss, this pull can be pretty scary because there's a lot going on, or at least like it seems like there is. You can simply sidestep each and every mechanic. And this is a general statement for everyone, for like your group. As long as you're not spazzing out with your movement and like strafing left and right and jumping up and down and doing all this crazy stuff, as soon as they cast their little tentacles, all you have to do is sidestep. As soon as a frontal is targeting you, all you have to do is sidestep again. It's a very easy fight. And if you do the pull properly, they'll be synced. So it's very easy to dodge everything. The big thing here though, is you really want to make sure you're staying in melee of the worm, because if you do step out of melee, it'll melee whoever's closest, which can be a problem. All right, and then the last fight, Unbound Abomination. This video is a little bit long, but that's all right. This fight is kind of awkward as a tank because your primary goal is to keep the boss in a position that allows for your group to have room to bait the frontal towards the old pools. For the most part, you do a good job at this outside of a few exceptions where the boss was like a little too close to old pools for at least my liking. You want enough room for your DPS to stand comfortably in between boss and where you guys were. So you always want to bait the frontal going, it depends on your group, but you basically always want it baiting clockwise where you'll be moving counterclockwise, or vice versa. Again, it depends on your group. And then also make sure when you're cutting the boss that you're spamming Blessed Hammer to generate Holy Power if you don't have any Charges of Judgment. You do this later in the fight, but not on every single movement. You do it on like every other. And then lastly, the scariest overlaps is when the boss hits 100 energy, since the Titan Keeper will be busy eradicating the Visages. At this point, he's going to stop granting your group the Dispel for a short period of time. And then this is when you're going to want to make sure to use your defensives, as well as like things like Hand of Sacrifice. And just a little thing, you can also remove your own dot with Fireblood for a little extra damage. But anyways, you guys ended up timing this, so congrats on your Keystone Master for the Underrot, and pretty good run. So really quickly, just a quick overview. Most of the run, you did a pretty good job of keeping Solder up, Shield of the Righteous. Your uptime on Ardent Defender though, and Consecration could be significantly improved. You really want to make sure you're keeping Consecration down and using Ardent Defender like on cooldown. Other cooldown usage like Guardian and Bubble can definitely be used more, but that's not always the case. It really depends. It's like a case-to-case basis, right? And then again, there are a few pulls that were specifically like rough, and I'm talking like pulling ticks. Anyways, thanks so much, Jackie Mays, for submitting this footage to me. It was really fun to break down and go through. I hope you learned something. I hope this helped anyone who was also watching. I want to give a huge shout out, though, to also all my other Patreons who support me and allow me to do this, because this has been really fun. Anyways, I hope you guys are all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.